Hi guys, Sci-Fi Recapped here. Before we start, warning. Spoilers ahead. Today, I'm gonna explain a 2002 American crime movie called Catch Me If You Can, which is based on the biography of Frank Abagnale, a con artist who claimed to pose as a pilot, doctor, and prosecutor and forged checks worth millions of dollars before he got caught. The movie begins with a television program telling the story of an infamous con artist, Frank Abagnale Jr., who performed various cons in many parts of the world before his 19th birthday. From 1964 to 1967, he successfully impersonated a Pan American Airways pilot, a chief resident pediatrician at a Georgian hospital, and assistant attorney general at the state of Louisiana. We then see Carl Hanratty, an FBI agent tasked to capture Abagnale, visiting him in an unnamed French prison. He intends to read to Frank the extradition terms, but Frank appears to be badly sick. His condition worsens, causing Carl to frantically call for medics and deliver Frank to the medical ward. Frank briefly escapes, but he could not get far as Carl and his men can easily catch up to him. He gave up running and told Carl he wanted to go home. 6 years earlier, Frank Jr. attended a gala dinner at New Rochelle Rotary Club, where the club president, Jack Barnes, presented Frank William Abagnale Sr., his father, an honorary member status of the club. At home, Frank Sr. danced with his wife, a French lady named Paula, and enthusiastically told his son the story of how they met, which Frank Jr. had heard a few times. The next day, Frank Sr. woke his son up and asked whether he had a black suit to attend an important meeting. He persuaded a tailor to borrow a suit for a military funeral. Turns out, they were going to Chase Manhattan Bank, where Frank Sr. asked for a business loan, but he was rejected because he was investigated for tax fraud by the IRS. Although he claimed that he is not a criminal and that a bank as big as Chase Manhattan would not risk too much in giving him a loan, the bank was firm on its decision. They moved to a smaller house as they ran out of money. Frank Jr. also moved school. On his 16th birthday, Frank Sr. opened a checking account for his son, to which he asked why he would open him an account in a bank that rejected his request for a loan. His father replied that one day he would find the account useful. He came to the French class and one of the school bullies told him he looked like a substitute teacher, to which he played along. He impersonated his school's French teacher for weeks, giving lessons and assignments. He even held a parent-teacher meeting to discuss a school field trip. The principal furiously told his wrongdoing to his parents while Frank waited outside and gave advice to a girl who forges a doctor's appointment to skip classes. Arriving home, Frank noticed Jack Barnes from the Rotary Club was visiting, although his father was not at home. He suspected that his mother had an affair with Jack. She gave him some money and let him go outside. When he came back, he found lawyers already in his house. Soon he learned that his parents filed for divorce, and he needed to decide whose custody he would be put into. Devastated by the situation, he stormed off the house, headed for the train station, and bought a ticket to the Grand Central. To survive, Frank Jr. attempted to perform cons but failed as most of his targets would not receive checks. He then observed an airline pilot who seemed famous as people turned their heads when he walked by, and kids asked for his autograph. He aspired to impersonate a pilot, starting with posing as a student journalist to interview a real Pan Am pilot. He learned important things about being a pilot, including identification badges, useful phrases to talk with other stakeholders, and the topic he was most interested in, paychecks. He then went by the identity of Frank Taylor and forged Pan Am checks to pay for his life. One day, when he wanted to cash a check, he flirted with a teller lady at the bank. She gladly explained to him the mechanism of drawing checks at the bank. The Micker machine used a special ink to encode the account numbers to the checks, then the number was routed. Frank then purchased a Micker encoder from an auction so he could manipulate the account numbers by himself. The FBI started to become aware of this suspicious activity, but they have not figured out his identity. Frank Jr. met with his dad at a fancy restaurant and bought him a Cadillac. However, Frank Sr. was afraid that the IRS would become more suspicious of him driving a Cadillac, considering his record with tax frauds. He insisted on taking the train home, then Frank Jr. left. He told his dad he was going to Hollywood. 3 FBI agents, Carl Hanratty, M. Dursky, and Fox, were chasing leads in a hotel. They soon learned Frank was still in the same building and planned an assault. Carl went by himself to the hotel room, finding the messy room. Frank appeared and introduced himself as Barry Allen, the Secret Service agent who got there first and was also after the con man. Confused, Carl asked for his identification, but Frank distracted him. Then he successfully escaped, although Carl had known his face and voice. Frank met again with the real Pan Am pilot he interviewed earlier. The pilot told him about the con artist who had gone popular in the news, dubbed Skyway Man. The media even called him James Bond of the Sky, inspiring Frank to become as cool as James Bond in real life. He bought fancy suits and a sports car. When hanging out in a hotel, he made out with a famous model, Cheryl, who was attracted to him. On the night of Christmas Eve, he called Carl at the FBI office, introducing himself as Barry Allen. He gave Carl an address, which Carl did not believe was real. Carl swore that he would eventually catch Frank. After the call ended, Frank stepped out of his hotel room, which turned out to be the real address he was giving to Carl earlier. Meanwhile, Carl was studying his leads at a diner when a waiter accidentally saw his papers and asked if he was a comic book fan because he saw Barry Allen, the real name of the Flash superhero character, on his papers. Carl deduced that the con man he was after was only a kid because he used comic book references. After filtering potential suspects, he visited Paula's house and finally identified Frank's face from his old yearbook photo. They then knew the identity of the con artist, Frank Abagnale Jr. Meanwhile, Frank already changed his identity to Frank Connors, a medical doctor, after he met a naive nurse, Brenda Strong, at a hospital. He forged his graduate certificate from Harvard Medical School and applied as a pediatrician at a hospital Brenda worked in. He gradually fell in love with Brenda. When they started to make out in his office, he was called to the emergency room. He threw up at the sight of blood and recited conversations from a medical documentary he watched earlier. On the other hand, Carl visited Frank Sr. and noticed the letters he received from his son. He retrieved an address from Atlanta, Georgia, and immediately headed there with his team. Fortunately, the apartment was empty. At his new apartment, Frank was making out with Brenda. She told him she was kicked out of her house after she had an abortion years ago. Frank decided to help her by meeting her parents and asking for their permission to marry her. He learned that Brenda's father was a lawyer, so he crafted a story that he was a lawyer who practiced law for a year before he went to medical school. Brenda's father seemed attracted to Frank's background. Brenda even begged her father to let Frank work for him as it was very difficult for him to find an assistant prosecutor. Somehow, Frank's charm convinced Brenda's family. He passed the bar exam and got the job at her father's office. Now that he was engaged, he met his father again to invite him to his wedding. He already arranged first-class airline tickets and expensive suits for him to wear, but Frank Sr. seemed disappointed. Having no one to talk to, Frank called Carl again. He asked Carl to stop chasing him as he wanted to marry and settle down, but Carl would not let that happen. Knowing that Frank would not be able to change his name, or he would risk his engagement, Carl searched for an engagement announcement from a man named Frank Connors. Carl and his team came to Frank and Brenda's engagement party, hosted by Brenda's parents. Frank, realizing he might get caught, desperately told Brenda the truth, and escaped with a bunch of cash just before Carl got to him. He instructed Brenda to meet him in 2 days at the Miami International Airport and they would fly away and live together. However, when Brenda got there exactly at the designated time, he noticed undercover FBI agents all around her and refused to come out of his car. He drove away, leaving Brenda puzzled at the airport. Knowing that the airport was heavily guarded and there seemed to be no way he would board a plane unnoticed, Frank used his pilot identity to host an on-campus stewardess recruitment program and recruited 8 beautiful girls to draw the police's attention while he sneaked his way to the plane bound for Spain. The investigation continued. The FBI learned that Frank used real, printed checks that only a few places could produce. In Europe, one of those places is France. Carl remembered his interview with Paula, who told him she came from the French village of Montrichard. He chased Frank to France and found him in a printing facility where he printed all his forged checks. He did not believe Carl was really going to capture him, but after stepping out of the facility, he was immediately captured by police and transferred to a French prison. Carl and Frank are now on a plane approaching New York. Frank reminds Carl of his promise to call his father once he lands, but Carl replies that his father is dead after tripping off the stairs. Frank is devastated by the news and locks himself inside the airplane's lavatory, then escapes and runs to Paula's house. He observes from the window that his mother has married Jack and has a little daughter. Frank then surrenders to Carl and is sentenced to 12 years in prison. Sometimes, Carl visits Frank and tells his stories at work. Frank occasionally helps Carl with leads on fraud checks. Later, Carl tasks Frank to work with the FBI, helping with fraud checks, so his sentence may potentially get reduced. Frank agrees but does not find himself very comfortable at office work. He plans to use his pilot identity to fly away. Carl meets him at the airport and, surprisingly, lets him perform his con as no one will chase him. He is convinced that Frank will come back on Monday to the FBI office again, which he does. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.